and Chris Sidoti. Their speech will explore the implications of the Australian government's recognition of the State of Palestine. International human rights law experts with the United Nations, Professor Ben Saul and Chris Sidoti, with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. My name's Tom Connell, I'm the club's president and also a politics anchor at Sky News. Our guest today, or guests, Professor Ben Saul, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, and Chris Sidoti, human rights lawyer, advocate and investigator. The topic, if you like, or the label for it, Palestinian recognition, necessary but insufficient. I understand it's been worked on for some weeks, perhaps a little rewrite after the latest plan outlined by Donald Trump this week. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation at X, where our handle is @PressClubAust. You can also use the hashtag NPC. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, first of all, Professor Ben Saul.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I thank the Press Club for its invitation to discuss the epic human tragedy in Palestine that has defied resolution for over a century. Today's event is timely, as Tom said, following President Trump's latest bid for a Nobel Prize by bringing peace to Gaza. Australia was amongst the first countries to recognise Israel and is amongst the last to recognise Palestine, bringing us into the international mainstream. More than three-quarters of the world, over 150 countries, now recognise Palestinian statehood, as does the United Nations. The momentum is driven by horror at Israel's excessive destruction in Gaza and impunity in Palestine, the failure of over 30 years of negotiations for a two-state solution since the Oslo Accords, Israel's persistent denial of Palestinian self-determination, de facto annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank by illegal Israeli settlements, and the unapologetic extremism of the Netanyahu government. Recognition is a long overdue circuit breaker when everything else has failed. The Palestinians were promised a state over a century ago. The 1947 United Nations proposal to divide British Palestine into two states was deeply unfair to Palestinians and failed. Israel unilaterally declared statehood in May 1948 after an insurgency against the British, terrorism against civilians, and even the assassination of United Nations officials. It effectively established independence after defeating invading Arab armies and took more territory than even the unfair partition plan gifted it. Australia recognised Israel within 6 months. The Palestine Liberation Organisation declared Palestine a state in 1988. International law does not prohibit unilateral declarations of statehood, as by Kosovo in 2008, which Australia later recognised as a state. But they do not create a state unless certain legal criteria are met. According to customary international law, reflected in the 1933 Montevideo Convention, statehood is a test of power, not morality. A state exists if it has a defined territory, a permanent population, an effective government, and an ability to enter into independent foreign relations. Some critics, such as John Howard and Alexander Downer, argue that recognising Palestine is illegal because it does not meet these requirements. This objection does not reflect mainstream international legal opinion. There is international consensus that Palestine's territory is presumptively defined by the pre-1967 war borders, encompassing the West Bank, including annexed East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The precise borders remain to be agreed, but this has never been fatal to the existence of states, many of whom have disputed borders. There is a core national population of Palestinians, potentially supplemented by refugees returning from abroad and excluding almost 700,000 Israelis living in illegal settlements. There is a clear capacity to enter into foreign relations. Palestine engages diplomatically with three-quarters of the world, is an observer state in the United Nations, makes treaties with other countries, and can appear in international tribunals. There is certainly doubt about the effectiveness and independence of Palestine's government, which controls only part of the West Bank and none of Gaza, and remains subject to a near 60-year Israeli military occupation. Yet, International law does not always rigidly apply the classical criteria for statehood in hard cases, but necessarily accommodates the kaleidoscope of real-world circumstances. The Montevideo Convention is a touchstone, not a millstone. Two other factors are crucial in Palestine. Firstly, Palestinians have an undisputed right to self-determination, which includes the freedom to become a state. Most countries are now persuaded that statehood can exceptionally emerge, even without full independence, where self-determination has been forcibly denied by occupation for so long. Parts of Palestinian territory have been officially or de facto annexed, and further annexation is imminently threatened. Last year, the International Court of Justice demanded Israel end its illegal occupation, which it said violates Palestinian self-determination, as soon as possible. The General Assembly gave Israel a deadline of last month. Secondly, recognition by other states can make a difference in unusual cases. Normally, recognition does not create a state, but simply endorses that the legal criteria are met. But recognition by 3/4 of the world is powerful evidence that Palestine is considered close enough to meeting the legal criteria to be regarded as a state, even under occupation, and tips the balance in favour of its statehood. A second objection to recognition is that two states should only emerge by negotiation under the Oslo Accords. Yet, last year, the International Court of Justice telegraphed that Palestine's future cannot legally depend on Israel's largesse. It found the Oslo Accords cannot detract from Israel's international obligations, including the duty to respect the right of self-determination, that self-determination cannot be, in its words, subject to conditions imposed by Israel, and that it is for the General Assembly and the Security Council, not Israel, to decide how to end the occupation consistent with the court's opinion. The court's impatience with Oslo came after 3 decades of failed talks. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu no longer even pretends to be interested in two states. Last month he declared, quote, "We are going to fulfil our promise that there will be no Palestinian state. This place belongs to us." He previously boasted, quote, that he put an end to the Oslo Accords. Recall that Israel, in recent months, murdered Hamas negotiators in Qatar, hardly inspiring faith in negotiations. Israel is not a good faith partner for peace, but aims to extinguish the possibility of an independent Palestine. Historically too, as former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan noted, Israel never offered a peace deal that respects Palestinians' legal rights. Continuing to call for negotiations, as some in this country do, is either naive or calculated to support continued Israeli intransigence and is doomed to fail. A third objection is that recognition rewards terrorism. Now, self-determination is the legal right of the whole Palestinian people, which cannot be denied on the basis of Hamas's actions. Non-recognition and denial of statehood, to the contrary, rewards Israel's illegal occupation, denial of self-determination, and international crimes. It also fails to address the root causes of terrorism and thus perpetuates indefinite violence. As the UN Secretary-General stated, Hamas's attack did not happen in a vacuum. Hamas was born chiefly to resist the occupation and out of the intergenerational suffering, humiliation, lack of opportunity and powerlessness it has inflicted on Palestinians. Many of Hamas's methods are clearly illegal and unjustifiable. Yet, as the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy emphasises, terrorism can only be defeated if the state violations of human rights that fuel grievances are addressed. The former US Director of National Intelligence warned that Israel's response to October 7 will have a, quote, generational impact on terrorism. The creation of states is often violent, especially where independence is forcibly suppressed. Israel itself was founded in blood, including the massacre of civilians by Jewish terrorist groups. Australia and the United Nations still recognised it. A fourth objection is that Israel's security must first be assured. Again, the International Court rejected this unilateral constraint on Palestinian rights, observing that Israel's security concerns cannot override the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force. There is no right of Israel to perpetually occupy its neighbours or to preventively disarm them, as Israel has been doing in Syria and Iran, or to deny self-determination in the hope of somehow absolutely preventing every possible future threat. Statehood matters because it confers many rights, including to control and defend national territory, govern and enforce laws, develop natural resources, trade, make treaties and engage in diplomacy, and protect the state's rights and that of its citizens. It includes a right to self-defence and collective self-defence against aggression or occupation. Statehood also imposes duties on Palestine to respect international law, including the sovereignty and security of its neighbours, and to respect human rights. Australia's recognition of Palestine enables it to establish diplomatic, trade and other relations for mutual benefit, although nothing flows automatically from recognition. Both sides retain freedom to determine the extent of their future interactions. Of course, being a state and recognition of it does not guarantee rights in practice. But recognition significantly raises the legal and political price for violating those rights, isolates Israel and the United States, and adds momentum towards full independence, evident in the recent US and French-Saudi peace plans. Recognition is not merely symbolic, but it cannot stop starvation or other war crimes, end foreign annexation, occupation and illegal settlements, or bring about full independence. Israel's extreme war of vengeance has proved a grave threat to the very survival of Palestinians, as well as endangering Israeli hostages and the future of Israel's own security. Decades of impunity have emboldened Israel to believe that there are no constraints and to commit ever more serious atrocities. Now, President Trump's peace plan yesterday, and here's where the rewrite of my speech comes in, has been cautiously endorsed by not only Israel, but many Arab and Western states, including Australia. The plan's proposals are welcome for a ceasefire, release of hostages and prisoners, humanitarian aid under UN supervision, no forced displacement from Gaza, withdrawal of Israeli forces, and non-annexation of Palestinian land. Despite its political palatability in a world exhausted by the violence, key elements nonetheless raise red flags under international law. History suggests we should be sceptical of peace without justice, peace at any price, and plans imposed by outsiders without Palestinian consent. In particular, the transitional government proposed is not representative, excludes the Palestinian Authority, does not respect self-determination, and lacks legitimacy. There are no concrete benchmarks or timeframes for achieving representative governance. Self-determination and statehood under the plan are subject to vague and indeterminate conditions concerning Gaza's redevelopment, Palestinian Authority reform, and some dialogue between Israel and Palestine, thus essentially preserving Israel's preferred status quo of failed negotiations and indefinite deferral of statehood. Tellingly, although Israel apparently has accepted the plan, Netanyahu said soon after that statehood, quote, is not written in the agreement, and I saw overnight he said we will forcibly resist statehood. That's not a plan for peace. Oversight by a Trump-chaired Board of Peace is not authorised by the United Nations or under transparent multilateral control, and the US is a deeply partisan supporter of Israel and not an honest broker. Tony Blair, who might sit on this board, has little international legitimacy after illegally invading Iraq. An international stabilisation force, also outside UN control, appears to replace Israeli occupation with indefinite US-led occupation, contrary to self-determination. Partial Israeli occupation will continue, potentially indefinitely, through a, quote, security perimeter around all of Gaza's borders, and the demilitarisation of Gaza, if permanent, could leave it vulnerable to Israeli aggression. An economic development plan could result in foreign exploitation of resources without Palestinian consent. You've only got to look at Trump's talk about real estate deals and the neoliberal agenda that was imposed on Iraq after 2003 to imagine where this might lead. Amnesties for Hamas seem unconditional, even if they committed international crimes on October 7 or before or after, denying justice for its Israeli and other victims. The plan doesn't address accountability at all for Israeli international crimes and human rights violations in Palestine. There's no commitment to transitional justice, historical truth-telling, genuine reconciliation, or acknowledgement of the injustice done to Palestinians caused by Israel's foundation. The plan does not address fundamental issues at all, such as illegal settlements, borders, compensation, and refugees. In contrast to Trump's plan, the New York Declaration, endorsed just a few weeks ago in New York at the General Assembly, provides an alternative pathway to peace that does broadly respect international law, including self-determination, unification of Palestinian territories, representative governments, a UN stabilisation mission, and statehood. To conclude, I welcome Australia's recognition of Palestine, its protests at Israeli violations, and its global efforts to protect humanitarian personnel. But Australia should take more concrete action and play a stronger leadership role on human rights in Palestine, as Chris will explain. International law does not enforce itself. Selectivity, double standards are contributing to the breakdown of international law and its delegitimation. Australia is the world's 13th largest economy, more than a modest middle power. If we don't step up in a world where democracy and human rights are critically endangered at this moment, and our closest ally cannot be relied upon, then who will step up? Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for the introductions. Thanks, Ben, for preceding me. I too begin by recognising the Indigenous owners of the lands on which we meet today and thank their elders, past and present, for their custodianship. In acknowledging Indigenous ownership, I want to acknowledge a second event today, and that is that the great feast of Yom Kippur starts tonight. And so I greet all the Jewish people who are here in this room and those who may be watching. Gemar Hatima Tova. Ben has outlined why recognition was necessary. I want to describe why it is insufficient. To begin with, recognition addresses a consistent pattern of inconsistency in the way in which the Australian government has approached Israel and Palestine since the very beginning. It is a long way away, as the Prime Minister is fond of saying, but we have had engagement in this issue from the start. Australia was a member of the UN committee in 1947 that came up with the idea of two states, living in peace and security side by side, a Jewish state and an Arab state, it said in the UN resolution that Ben referred to. We were a member of the committee that came up with that proposal. We were the first state in the General Assembly vote, conducted alphabetically, to vote yes to the adoption of the proposal. And very quickly, we recognised the State of Israel. Doing so, not entirely in implementation of the resolution, because the resolution did not anticipate a unilateral declaration of independence by the State of Israel, and yet that's what occurred. Nonetheless, we proceeded to recognise the State of Israel, and when Doc Evatt was President of the General Assembly, Australia supported Israeli membership of the General Assembly and of the United Nations. So we were there at the time of those critical events, and we played a central role in relation to them. We recognised the State of Israel very quickly, but it's only now, 75 years later, that we have got round to recognising the state of Palestine. And even now, there are continuing inconsistencies. Ben has well outlined the Montevideo Convention provisions relating to recognition and about how the state of Palestine, in the acceptable international discourse of international lawyers, meets the 4 principal criteria under the Montevideo Convention. Having met those criteria, any additional conditions placed upon recognition become political matters rather than legal matters. I have no problem with the political conditions that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister set some months ago, conditions that have now been translated into commitments by the Palestinian Authority. They're political conditions, but Hamas should not be a member of a future government. There should be demilitarisation. There should be a restructuring of the Palestinian Authority. There should be elections. I have no trouble with those political conditions at all. But they're not being applied to the State of Israel. Why is there not a political condition that Likud, Jewish Power Party and Religious Torah Party should play no part in a future government of the State of Israel? Because they are parties that have been responsible for the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide in Gaza. Why should there not be similar provisions for full or partial demilitarisation of the State of Israel to ensure the security and peace within the region? Why should we not require truly democratic elections in the State of Israel rather than partially democratic elections that see the Palestinian citizens of Israel experiencing discrimination? 2 days ago, the Israel Country Brief and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade started out very early in the statement, the State of Israel is a robust parliamentary democracy. Well, it's not. So, recognition as a legal act has occurred, but it needs to be followed by consistency in the political approach to the State of Israel and the State of Palestine. That's just the first thing. In looking at what further steps are necessary, my approach is very much to depend upon the obligations that Australia has under international law. Talking about us as far away, as not having much influence, not being a great power, framing our response in those terms is framing a response based on the wrong question. It's the question, what can be effective? A fair enough question that we have to be addressed, but a secondary question. The primary question is, what are our legal obligations under international law and what must be done to meet them? There have been a number of decisions over the last year and a half that point very strongly to the fact that we have current, pressing, urgent legal obligations under international law to which we have provided a start of a response, but not much more than that. In January last year, the International Court of Justice ordered provisional measures in the case of South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention. In doing so, the court acknowledged that there was a possibility of genocide in Gaza. It did not decide the question of genocide, but it decided there was a possibility. And certainly no later than that decision by the court, perhaps earlier, the obligation that Australia has under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide was triggered. The Genocide Convention not only requires that we not commit genocide, it also requires that we act to prevent genocide. And that obligation to act to prevent was triggered by the International Court of Justice order of provisional measures. And the court made 2 further orders of provisional measures in April and May 2024, which reinforced the obligation to act to prevent. In July, the International Court of Justice issued its advisory opinion on the question of the lawfulness of Israel's occupation and the Israeli settlements. And the court said then that the occupation was unlawful and the settlements were unlawful, that Israel should act to end the occupation and it should withdraw all settlements from the occupied Palestinian territory. The court highlighted the obligations of other states under international law. It directed a large part of its opinion to other states, and that's us. And it said that other states have obligations not to aid or assist the continuation of the unlawful activity in any way. When I look at international law, I'm aware of these obligations, treaty obligations, the obligation under the Genocide Convention to act to prevent genocide, the obligation under the Geneva Conventions dealing with international humanitarian law to act to ensure that other states respect international humanitarian law. This is the basis of current legal obligation on Australia. There are things that we can do and should do that we have barely begun to do. One immediate step that should have been taken was a complete review by the Australian government, at least immediately after July last year, of all aspects of the relationship between Australia and the State of Israel, to identify those aspects that could be considered aiding or assisting the continuation of unlawful acts, and to consider any aspects of the relationship that may be assisting the commission of war crimes or crimes against humanity, or in any way preventing the risk of genocide in Gaza. And yet, I know of no such review. There should have been a review. The results should have been made public. If it exists, make it public. If it doesn't exist, do it. That's the starting point. Then there are a number of very specific acts that should be taken. The first is the prohibition of all military-related trade with the State of Israel. Australia has an arms embargo. What that means is disputed. It certainly means that Australia does not provide weapons and munitions to the State of Israel and has not done so for several years now. But that's not enough. You know, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister keep on reiterating that. The Prime Minister did again as recently as last night in response to some comments I made 2 days ago. That's not good enough. I accept and welcome the fact that we don't provide munitions and weapons, but we must also look at components. And here we're talking about the components for the F-35 fighter jets, which we know have been used by the Israeli military in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. This is certainly part of a broader international deal with Lockheed Martin, but we can't rely on the fact that this is part of an international deal and others are providing components and we don't need to worry about it. If components that are being manufactured here in Australia are finding their way into F-35 aircraft being used by the Israeli Air Force to bomb the hell out of Gaza, we share responsibility. It's as simple as that. Regardless of the trade relationships, the component construction industry, the supply chains, we have legal obligations. Next, we have to look at whether there are any materials that are being provided that can be used for the production of weapons by Israel itself. So this means, for example, steel that can be used in the production of tanks, or other components, including metals. Anything that can be militarily related needs to be caught. Dual-use items. We tend to import drones from Israel rather than export them. Drones are manufactured by the Israeli company Elbit, and they're some of the most effective in the world, particularly for surveillance. But we still need to look more broadly at dual-use items. That means items that can have civilian or military purposes. If they can have a military purpose, we should not be trading. So that's the first. It's arms-related trade, militarily related trade. It's not just a ban on the provision of weapons and munitions. Second, we should take the next step and end all military and trade cooperation with the State of Israel. In 2019, AusAid established a Trade and Defence Office in Jerusalem to promote defence cooperation and trade with the State of Israel. That office should be closed, and any defence cooperation components of Australian diplomacy in the Australian Embassy in Tel Aviv should be ended, as well as anything that promotes trade in areas that are questionable. Australian individuals, some are dual citizens, serve in the Israeli Defence Forces. And many soldiers or former soldiers come to Australia. Our Commission of Inquiry has found since June 2024 that the State of Israel is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, both individual acts and, importantly, through the whole pattern of strategy and operations there. We have said that any soldier, airman, aircrew, surveillance personnel, radar personnel, naval crew who have had any involvement in the war in Gaza is a suspect who should be investigated and, if the evidence warrants it, prosecuted, and, if a court is satisfied, convicted. The necessary consequence of that is that anyone, whether an Australian citizen or not, who seeks to enter this country, having served in any arm of the Israeli military in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023, should be treated as a suspect and investigated and, if necessary, prosecuted. We have, under the Commonwealth Criminal Law, Australian domestic criminal offences relating to the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide anywhere in the world. So our law covers this. This is not just international law, this is our law. We need, in fact, to broaden the scope of the existing law. At the time of the ISIS uprising, our law was amended to criminalise or prohibit and criminalise Australian citizens serving in international armed groups, foreign armed groups. That needs to be extended to cover service in foreign military forces as well. There is no reason why Australian citizens should be permitted to serve in the military forces of another country, whether it's China or Russia or the United States or Israel. It's as simple as that. We need to sanction individuals in Israel more broadly. Positive steps already. We have sanctioned the two most extremist ministers in the Israeli government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and we have sanctioned a number of the more extremist, violent Israeli settlers. That's a good start. But the responsibility for the war crimes, the crimes against humanity and the genocide extends more broadly through the Israeli political and military leadership. So sanctioning needs to be extended. We need to end cooperation in innovation, security and development. Again, to go to the DFAT briefing. In recent years, there has been significantly increased engagement across a range of sectors, including innovation, security and defence. Innovation means information technology, which means surveillance technology, which means all of the technology that is being used to watch Palestinians, particularly through facial recognition and other forms of very sophisticated IT. That cooperation means that we should stop importing this software, these technologies or techniques, because in doing so we are funding research and development in Israel of the very technologies that are being used against the Palestinians. A simple step. We should end trade with settlements. The International Court of Justice made it clear last June that settlements are unlawful. The Israeli government has responded to pressure building in Europe about trade with settlements by disguising the origins of products so that they may be seen as manufactured in Israel on their stamps rather than in the settlements. It's up to the State of Israel to prove that a product is made in Israel and not in a settlement. And if they fail to do that, well then the entitlement, the obligation even, extends beyond trade with settlement products to trade with products coming out of Israel. Unless the Israeli authorities make the distinction possible, the sanctions need to be more broadly based. And also relating to settlements, we should end all funds transfer from Australia to settlements themselves or to organisations that support the creation and the maintenance of settlements and settlement activity. And we should end tax deductibility for any Australian organisations that raise money for those purposes. The obligation not to aid or assist the continuation of the unlawful acts means stopping any form of Australian activity that supports the establishment and maintenance of settlements. And finally, we should very clearly indicate that we will respect and enforce orders of international courts. The time for fudging this issue is long past. We have clear obligations under international law, and we should be very clear that if anybody subjected to an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court sets foot in this country, that person will be arrested. These are simple steps, they're not dramatic steps, and they're steps that we necessarily must take. Recognition is an important step. It starts to address the issue of inconsistency, but the obligations that we have under the law extend well beyond recognition. So it's necessary to recognise, but it is clearly far from sufficient.
Thanks, Ben and Chris. Just one to each of you from me before I go to the floor. Ben, you mentioned the Trump plan, and just one element that you found a red flag, if you like, the lack of justice. Understanding why you would want that, but is it a high bar and one that might hold things up? You know, people right now in Palestine might say, that's great from a legal perspective, I want my life back. Would you understand someone saying they'd settle for the lack of justice if it would speed up being able to end the war?
Thanks, Tom. And it's a classic dilemma in any conflict resolution scenario. Do you trade justice for short-term peace? I think experience tells us that if you don't address accountability and justice, then you can often have a resumption of violence, because those grievances, as I mentioned, are often causes that drive continuing conflict. Most peace agreements, even if they don't deal with the question of justice or accountability immediately, still do address them in a general sense and kick them down the road. A good example is Northern Ireland. The problem with this peace agreement is that there's no mention at all of justice and accountability, and I think that's setting up the peace agreement for failure.
So even if it's a bookmarking of it or broad statements, something is there to be able to be returned to, it would be what you'd want at the minimum. That's what you're saying?
Exactly. And look, certainly bits of this plan are vague on detail, and a lot of it has to be filled in through subsequent negotiations. And
Sure.
This is common in lots of peace plans, but you still have to have the broad outlines of the minimum conditions, and that's what's lacking.
Chris, to you, you mentioned the caveats Australia and others as well placed on recognition of Palestine, that on one side it would require the Palestinian state to be demilitarised and it wouldn't for Israel. Now, if I think of that region at least, if both sides were demilitarised, it would be a situation where Palestine would not, I would think, face a great threat, but Israel would from several neighbours. That doesn't strike me as workable. Israel would be invaded in days, wouldn't it?
No, but I accept your point, Tom. It would have to be accompanied by international security guarantees, without doubt. There is a continuing obligation arising from that resolution in 1947. The international system played a key role in the establishment of this mess, and there is a continuing obligation to take responsibility for it. So maybe some form of international security guarantees would be a step forward. But the underlying point is that it is unreasonable to expect a total demilitarisation of Palestine when Israel is a nuclear-armed state next door. This issue has to be addressed. So what I'm arguing is not so much that Israel should be demilitarised, but that it is naive to expect a complete demilitarisation of Palestine when Israel is what it is. And can I, as well, just take a slightly different tack from Ben for a minute? I support the Trump peace plan 100%. I agree with everything Ben said in his critique of it, but in fact, it's not worth the paper it's not written on. But this situation has always worked on the basis of smoke and mirrors. And if by pretending that this peace plan is going to work, we stop the killing, which for me is the absolute #1 priority, it's got my 100% support. And when the killing stops and the starvation campaign stops and the hostages are released and the Palestinians arbitrarily detained are released, then we can all admit that the peace plan's going nowhere, because it won't. It's smoke and mirrors. But for God's sake, let's stop kids being killed.
Plenty of interested colleagues. Dominic Giannini from AAP to begin with.
Thank you both for your speech and your insights. I wanted to ask about the responsibility to protect, which is something I haven't heard a lot about in the Australian context. So we support it, and in 2015 we were critical of Syria failing to protect citizens and were critical of the Security Council as well. Now, we haven't used similar language when it comes to the war in Gaza. So I want to know, in your eyes, has Australia and more broadly the international community abandoned the doctrine? And then just, if I might, the coalition has said it would revoke Palestinian statehood. People who support this, are you concerned it sets up a precedent when nations either engage in civil war or are taken over? I'm thinking countries like Afghanistan, where the Taliban have regained control, Myanmar, where there's a junta, civil wars throughout Africa.
Look, I think responsibility to protect internationally has been dead in the water since Libya in 2011, because large parts of the world felt betrayed by the overthrow of Gaddafi. I mean, there were in some ways good reasons why that happened, but it's not a language which resonates in the Security Council. And on top of that, you add the dysfunction geopolitically between the great powers on the Security Council. It's just not a language which is mobilising states in the international community. I wish it were, but it's unfortunately we've moved past that post Cold War high point, I guess. On revocation of recognition of statehood, I mean, that's a pretty unprecedented step, actually. I mean, it's more common, of course, to revoke recognition of governments if you don't like the flavour of a new government. But once a state has been established, to somehow say that even though the rest of the world recognises that we don't, would be a very strange move, and not one which states are in the habit of doing.
Your question and Ben's answer relate both to the responsibility to protect as an obligation on everybody else in the world, and I agree completely. But there is a second level of the responsibility to protect, which lies on states, individual states that are combatants in a war or a conflict. So in this conflict, the state of Israel, as the occupying power and as a belligerent, has an obligation to protect civilians in the West Bank, in Gaza. And in a situation in Gaza, it is failing to exercise that obligation. It's not just a matter of directly killing, but of not doing anything to protect people. And they use the excuse that we leaflet a suburb and send pings on phones telling people to evacuate. But, you know, where on earth are they supposed to evacuate to? Now, there is no doubt at all that under the Geneva Conventions, Israel has obligations to protect and is failing to meet those obligations.
Thanks both.
Okay, Tom, can I just add to that? I mean, I agree with Chris 100% on that. I mean, the fact that international action seems to be paralysed on the Security Council absolutely makes it so much more important that we act unilaterally. And to Chris's list of things that Australia could do, I mean, I'd add a few others. We could join international litigation in the International Court of Justice. We could support more strongly the International Criminal Court's investigation. We could defend the International Criminal Court from attacks by United States sanctions. We could support Chris's own Commission of Inquiry, which Australia has not been very helpful on. And we could oppose strongly sanctions on my fellow Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, and on Palestinian human rights NGOs, because the sanctions on Francesca are a violation of the United Nations Convention on Privileges and Immunities, of the United Nations Headquarters Agreement, and they are really designed to destroy human rights monitoring and supervision of badly behaving states.
Adam Langberg from the ABC.
Chris, you've examined conflicts all around the world. How does what you've seen in Gaza compare to what you've seen during your career? And Ben, the Australian international response to this, how does that differ to what you've seen in conflicts previously as well?
I can't claim to have examined conflicts all around the world, but I have looked at a lot. And the most unique aspect of what has happened in Gaza is that people, the Palestinians in Gaza, have no means of escape. In every other conflict in decades, and probably in my lifetime, so that's almost 75 years, there has been the capacity for people to get away. We saw in the first months of the Ukraine war that I think it was 6 or 7 million Ukrainians left Ukraine, went to Poland and Germany and Western Europe. Today, I was making the comment earlier that the situation in Sudan is the only situation that can come even close to the horror of Gaza. And the people in Sudan, though, have got borders that they can cross to escape from the killing and the starvation. The people in Gaza are captured. They can't go anywhere. The Israeli authorities, since the first day, have been pursuing an operation of total destruction. And the fact that you've got 2 million people squeezed into an area half the size of Canberra who cannot get away from saturation bombing, starvation, denial of medicines and medical equipment, access to hospitals, access to schools for their kids, makes this unique.
On Australia's response, I'll just give you one contrast, which is compare how we've addressed the Russian invasion of Ukraine with how we've responded on Gaza. Australia's been absolutely right to throw the law book and heap political pressure on Russia for its invasion, really comprehensive sanctions on Russian nationals, as well as financial and other sanctions on the Russian state, supporting all kinds of international litigation against Russia, supporting a war damage compensation fund to address the harm done. Contrast that with our position on Gaza, which has been pretty tepid, actually. I mean, they've tried this kind of even-handed approach, condemning Hamas, condemning Israeli excesses, but beyond that, I mean, all we've really done is sanctions on 2 far-right ministers, not the war cabinet responsible for the international crimes in Gaza, not the military leaders in charge of prosecuting the war, not all of the other bits of the Israeli state you could sanction in order to heap pressure on Israel. We haven't talked about accountability. We haven't talked about compensation for war damage. I mean, why should Arab states pay for the reconstruction of Gaza when Israel destroyed it? Now, some of that destruction is legal, but a lot of it is illegal, and in international law terms, attracts Israel's legal responsibility to make good on the damage that it's done. So I think I'm, personally, as an Australian, I'm bitterly disappointed by the Australian government's response, and we only recognise Palestine after 50, 100,000 Australians marched across the Sydney Harbour Bridge and finally gave a shove to the politicians to have some spine.
Next question, Naveen Razik from SBS.
Thanks, gentlemen. Excellent speeches from both of you. Tony Blair, can I be mischievous and ask for your initial reaction when you heard the news that he was going to be involved in this Trump peace plan? And do you think that this Board of Peace can actually be effective in terms of reducing the temperature of the conflict and allowing, demilitarisation of Hamas, but also getting Israel to, lower the temperature as well of its actions?
I avoid dealing in hypotheticals. I try to deal with facts. Is Tony Blair going to be involved in the implementation of the Trump peace plan?
It sounds like he may be involved in the Board of Peace. He may have been involved in some of the negotiations.
If it happens,
with US
I'm happy
officials.
to comment on it.
Very good.
Look, I'd just add that Tony Blair was involved in the quartet process, which led nowhere, so there's not a positive track record there. And secondly, if you want a genuinely legitimate international oversight of a future plan in Gaza, use the United Nations. I mean, that's what it's for. It's what it's always been there for. It has the legitimacy of everybody being involved in it, and it's not at the whim of Donald Trump, which is what this board would be.
Thank you.
Mark Kenny from the ANU.
Thank you, gentlemen. I wonder if I could ask both of you to reflect on the performance of journalism, particularly in Australia, through this period. I know when I've written a lot about this conflict over months and years, really, you get attacked from, let's call them broadly, the right and the left, or from the Israel side and from another perspective that is arguing about the justice for Palestinians. So I wonder if I could ask you to reflect on the performance of journalism, in particular the use of the term genocide. Is that exclusively something that should be determined by a court, or is that for public discourse? Is it widely understood? And just a very quick second question, although it's a big issue, the use of human shields. This is pretty much a key defence that Israel has for everything that it does. Now, my understanding is that there are obligations on any belligerent in relation to innocent third parties. And yet we hear this justification put forward that Hamas is hiding in tunnels underneath these hospitals or these schools or whatever it might be. Even if these are human shields, even if that is true, and let's accept it at face value, for example, the human shields aren't willing human shields. Is there a legal impunity there to simply disregard them in going after combatants?
Maybe I go first this time. When you ask me about journalists, my absolute first comment is that the journalists in Gaza have been extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In a situation where the Israeli authorities from day one have excluded foreign journalists, we have depended entirely on Palestinian journalists in Gaza to get out information about what is happening. And they have done so not just with their own investigations and reporting, but with video evidence, photographic evidence, things that can be confirmed. They've had an eye to producing evidence that we use in our commission because it is verifiable evidence. And hundreds of them have lost their lives as a result of it. So when you ask me what has been the performance of journalists, I have to say that the Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been models of heroism, of commitment to information, of all the things that the best journalism stands for. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there have been the pressures that you describe. I wouldn't describe them though as left and right.
It's a crude term, I acknowledge.
Yeah. I mean, it's those that are defenders of the state of Israel and those that are supporters of the state of Palestine, if you want to characterise. But there are a lot of Palestinian people who are extraordinarily conservative, and there are a lot of Israelis who are very progressive, if you want to use that, or left. And there is also a great deal of division now in Israeli society and amongst Jewish people generally. So the definitions are a bit different. But I know that journalists are under enormous pressure. And, I have been told by Australian journalists about the pressure that they are under. Your colleagues ring me up and ask for information and almost apologetically say, I'm getting this information from you, but I don't know whether I'll ever be able to use it because I may not be allowed to publish. This is being said to me in words to that effect.
Yeah, there's plenty of fear around.
There's plenty of fear around, and as Trump would say, it's a violation of the First Amendment to the US Constitution.
Huh.
But I think that we are seeing, as the 2 years have gone on, we have seen more and better and stronger reporting, because I think that there is a realisation, I would even say now a general realisation, that was the Israeli government and the Israeli military, not the Israeli people, the Israeli government and the Israeli military are doing in Gaza is totally unacceptable. And that realisation is emboldening journalists to be able to report far more directly.
Thank you. I wonder, Ben, could you just address that question of whether we should say genocide and also the human shield thing?
Sure. Genocide was the subject of the last report that our Commission released 2 weeks ago. And we made a finding of genocide. It took us 2 years to get to that point. If any of you journalists are anxious about that story, from now on you can say the operations in Gaza, which the Commission of Inquiry has found to be genocide. We can provide cover for you and for the Prime Minister. It's not up to the courts alone. The courts are the ultimate authority. When we released our report, we acknowledged that explicitly. The International Court of Justice is the highest authority on this issue. But that does not mean that we have to sit around and wait for the court to deliver its decision, which will be 2 years at least, maybe 3 or maybe more years away. In producing our report, the Commission was very aware that we would be producing the most authoritative statement on this issue until the court rules. And whether it agrees with us or disagrees with us, it's the most authoritative. So I think now, I don't know how we would have found if we had released a report a year ago or a year and a half ago, but at this point, for us, there is no doubt. And I think journalists too should be coming to the same conclusion. There is no doubt, while acknowledging that the court is yet to rule on the subject. So I don't in any way take away from the authority of the court.
One of the primary original stated aims from Israel, if we go back to 2023, was degrading Hamas enough to not carry out another attack. Given that stated aim of theirs and the unique nature of Hamas, where it is, tunnels and intertwining, was it ever possible to get that aim without falling foul of international law? Were those two never going to be possible?
No, I think they were possible. I think they were possible because the Israelis have shown themselves, prior to the 7th of October, very adept at targeted assassinations of military leaders in Israel and everywhere else in the world. 7 October was an enormous failure by the Israeli military, but they're not completely stupid. They have chosen this tactic because it was the tactic that suited their major objectives, but it was not the only tactic available to them.
Okay. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, international humanitarian law is precisely designed as a balance between military necessity, which is allowing states to fight wars and win, and protection of civilians and from suffering and unnecessary violence in armed conflict. So the tools are there if you apply them properly. And the problem was that Israel waged this vengeful war. It called it existential when it wasn't. I mean, you know, Hamas invaded Israel for 24, 48 hours and then was repulsed. I mean, Israel has nuclear weapons, hundreds of thousands of forces, all the US military kit it can get its hands on, 2 US aircraft carriers sitting off the coast at that time. Israel was going to be fine, right? It wasn't a situation where you had to take the gloves off in a kind of existential war for survival. So if Israel had done this more deliberately, more carefully, you know, not dropping high explosive munitions on densely populated urban areas, but fighting in a more methodical way according to humanitarian law, yes, it would have incurred greater Israeli military casualties, but that's the price of not murdering civilians. And that's the lesson that Israel has lost, you know, calling itself the most moral army in the world along the way in the last few years.
Just conscious we've got a few more to get to, so I'm jumping in there. Emma McDonald from Women in Media.
Emma MacDonald from Women in Media. Thank you both for your important words. I have 2 separate questions for both of you. Professor Saul, do you think the UN will ever recover its authority after what's happened? And Chris, firstly, I want to thank you for being a beacon of rational thoughts and words, sanity and humanity on an international stage where all of these qualities seem to be sadly lacking. My question to you is, are you personally perplexed by Anthony Albanese's approach to Palestine when you and I would remember that he used to protest and hold a megaphone calling for an end to the Israeli occupation?
Thanks. Look, on UN legitimacy, look, I'm an optimist, and I hope the UN will recover its authority and, you know, get some more runs on the board in future. You know, this has always been a problem. There are always cycles of you know, ups and downs in the United Nations. You know, the Rwandan genocide was a worse failure than Gaza, frankly. I mean, 800,000 people killed in 100 days. UN sat on its hands, even though it had forces there, didn't intervene, didn't send reinforcements. So we've been here before, and in worse situations. The UN's there because it's useful. You know, it's the one place where states can go. You know, countries that radically disagree with each other, politically, economically, militarily, in the hope that dialogue will, you know, beat violence. Now, that's always going to be a vain hope in some circumstances. It's never going to solve every war, but I think this is the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, and I think in that time the United Nations has achieved an enormous amount and doesn't always get the credit for it, gets blamed when it doesn't act. Actually, it's often because of the failure of the permanent members of the Security Council. You know, it's not the UN's fault, it's the United States' fault, or other key members that are blocking the action that most of the world wants. And that's what strikes me about the situation in Gaza. There's been a huge groundswell of popular public support worldwide for the plight of Palestinians. Most countries are opposed to what Israel is doing, and Israel and the US are now incredibly isolated. And I think that's a really positive sign for the future, actually.
We Australians like to think of ourselves as rugged individualists, but in fact we always travel in a pack. And the Prime Minister has wanted us to travel on Palestine in the pack of Western European states. And we've been doing that. You know, I'm all supportive and all praise for the changes in our vote in the General Assembly and now recognition, all good. But the Prime Minister announced last week that we would seek election to the Security Council for 2029-30. That's good. But if we want to be on the Security Council, we've got to turn ourselves from camp followers to being the leaders of the pack.
Thank you.
Racing the clock now. I'm going to try to get through 2 more, so if everyone could have great, insightful, succinct thoughts. Katrina Jackson from Pearls and Irritations.
Thank you, Tom. Katrina Jackson, Pearls and Irritations. Chris and Ben, just to begin with, thank you very much, both of you, for your moral clarity ever since October 2023. It's something everyone in this room, and I'm sure many of the readers and the listeners and the watchers and the ABC appreciate. You've both emphasised that very bizarre attack of national modesty that seems to have afflicted many of our parliamentarians when discussing Palestine. I don't think we've heard modest middle power so many times ever in my lifetime from our Prime Minister as well. You've both given us a list of things we should and could do, and that's a very useful list and a depressingly long list. A correspondent from the Middle East who I was speaking to last week reminded me that actually we're not a modest middle power when it comes to influence in Israel. We actually have quite a lot of influence in Israel. I'm not going to ask you to recite the list of what we could and should do again, but I'm wondering what you both think about what it is that's stopping us from acting on those moral and legal obligations.
Well, I think the domestic politics are pretty turbocharged on this. I mean, there's a political divide between the major parties on this, which has been pretty toxic, I'd say, over the last 2 years. There's lots of interest group politics, which has driven division as well. There's fear of being stigmatised as anti-Semitic if you criticise something Israel says. I mean, to go back to what Mark says, I mean, I agree 100%. I've encountered a lot of journalists who are afraid of losing their job, like Antoinette Lattouf, or are otherwise just self-censoring. And also because these are in some ways, the international law issues are complex. I mean, I think the genocide question is a much more complicated one, for example, than the illegality of the settlements, which everybody agrees is illegal. So, journalists aren't international lawyers, I get that. But I don't think those are valid reasons for our politicians to cop out when they have lots of access to good advice, including people like Chris and others. And really need to lift their game and their literacy on issues in the Middle East, quite apart from the obvious humanitarian catastrophe, which should give you reason to speak out enough.
I agree with him.
And what can we do about it?
You'll have to forgive me. We've got one more through. I'm already over. Sorry, Katrina. Melissa Code to finish things off from the Mandarin.
Hi, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. I might pick up where Katrina left off and ask, the theme of your address is too little, too late. We've sort of watched in real time the trauma of this international tragedy heighten and increase, the complexity of the legal and political issues weigh up against what seem to be quite black and white moral issues. At what point could we have intervened before it was too little, too late? Where was that moment and why did we let it pass us by?
That's a really hard question. Look, for me, the issues had crystallised by around about April last year, so six months into the fighting. I mean, just to take one example of language that was being used, we looked at the question of the language when we were looking at the issue of genocide, and language was being used by all the top Israeli officials. 7-8 October 2023. It was clearly genocidal, but it could have been an emotional, traumatised reaction to what happened on that day, the killing of 1,200 people, 800 of whom were civilians. But by the time we got 6 months down the track and the same language was being used and the same military strategy was being deployed, any doubts were starting to disappear very rapidly. We reported our first reports, 3 of them, on the war in June 2024. So certainly by around about April, May, June, it was clear cut that what was happening was totally beyond the widest realms of imagining. I knew on the 7th of October 2023 that there would be a bloodbath, but I had no idea that 2 years later we would still have between 75 and 100 people being killed every day.
Look, I think it was obvious pretty early on that this was a gloves-off moment, a kind of 9/11 moment for the Israelis. by October, November of 2023. So I think everybody was on notice early on that this wasn't going to be a kind of typical mowing the grass operation. This was going to be something categorically different. And that should have sent alarm bells ringing in capitals worldwide. And as soon as Israel starts unleashing this kind of carpet bombing of Gaza, that's when we should have stepped up. Understandably, there was huge goodwill towards Israel after October 7, enormous sympathy for the incredible atrocities suffered by Israeli victims. But that was soon squandered, I think, as the way Israel fought the war just lost everybody very quickly.
Just one comment only. Remember Biden's visit to Israel a week after 7 October, and it was a very controversial visit. One thing he said then, very loud and clear, was, this is an event for you like 9/11 was for us. Don't make the mistakes that we made. And the Israelis didn't listen.
Gentlemen, thanks both for your time. You've got our guest speaker memberships. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Chris Sidoti and Ben Saul.
This is ABC News. Our top story is national home values have risen for the 8th month in a row, with supply issues